Well, thank you all for being here. This is wonderful to have you all here. Many of you were, of course, in the class that we were doing last year, which was on the book of Exodus. And I was saying to you last year that my expectation was we would return to that study this fall and just continue where we left off. We made it about halfway through Exodus, and I thought we'd probably finish that up. I didn't know at the time there'd be this little change in our overall schedule on Sunday mornings, and in the hopes that there might be others who'd like to join the class, as at least at the moment it appears would be the case, I thought it might make more sense to start something new. So we're going to be starting something new, and if you've been dying to hear the rest of Exodus, the tabernacle, all those laws and stuff, we'll figure out some class to run that in at some point or other, but probably not here, at least not this fall. So I thought in lieu of the class on Exodus, I would take up a course of study that I'm calling Historical Context of the Bible, which some of you may think to yourselves is suspiciously similar to the title of the book I just wrote. Historical and Chronological Context of the Bible. It's a great cure for insomnia. I'm telling you, it'll just knock you out, right, like that. So anyway, that's what we will do. I realize the cynics in the room are thinking this is just a sustained exercise in book promotion. And I want to disabuse you of that. That is not the reason I'm doing this, although if you'd like to buy this book, you may certainly do so. Not from me. I don't have, that's my last copy, honestly. So you can get it from Amazon. It's about $25. Cheap. It's a bargain, you know. I mean, just the paper's worth $25, let alone what the content might be. So if you just Google or just do a search on my name there, that book will pop up. But it is not required that you have the book for this class. I want to make that very clear. I'm not going to be otherwise depending on the idea that you'd be reading along, although if you'd like to do that, that would be fine and probably helpful. But the book itself was the result of a kind of frustrating experience I had some years back when I first took a job at the school where I teach, and one of the courses that I was assigned was entitled Context of the Bible. And I thought to myself, I know something about the context of the Bible. You know, I've heard of the Assyrians, and I know there's something about the Persians in there, and Babylon figures in. I thought, I can do this. And one of the things you discover when you have to teach something every day, 5 days a week, to a bunch of very inquisitive 9th and 10th graders is you don't know nearly as much as you thought you did, And I began to realize pretty soon how paper thin was my real understanding of a lot of the, really the great amount that we know about ancient history and how it may intersect with biblical history. I just found myself constantly running into and getting swamped in my own ignorance. And so I began to assemble material, and over the years, and it took an embarrassing number of years to produce this book, but finally kind of was able to put it together, at least in a preliminary way, and that's what this book was really the result of. I've always had this desire, I guess, ever since this kind of reached its conclusion, to teach this material here, more or less to get it off my chest. I've been studying it, kind of getting it in my head, and I thought, wow, I'd really like to teach this subject in this setting here at First Presbyterian. So it's not so much to get you to buy the book, but hopefully it is a way to get acquainted with some of these matters that have to do with ancient history and how ancient history intersects with biblical history. And so that's what the course is about. And I will plan to make it perfectly accessible with or without the book, but that is really the reason the book was produced. So this morning I'm going to do a little bit of a preliminary kind of introduction to the whole course, not looking at any particular time period specifically, but more just a kind of defense, I would say, of the entire project. And hopefully that will induce you to want to return and participate more. This morning I'd like to refer you to the book of Isaiah, and it's in chapter 20 of Isaiah. I remember the first time I read this chapter and just actually thought about what I was reading. And that was my first clue that I needed to know more than I did about what was going on in the world at the time that Isaiah was reflecting in this text. So if you would find your way there, let's read it. We're in Isaiah chapter 20. This is the word of God. In the year that the commander-in-chief, who was sent by King Sargon of Assyria, came to Ashdod and fought against it and took it, at that time the Lord had spoken to Isaiah the son of Amoz, saying, "Go and loose the sackcloth from your loins, and take your sandals off your feet." And he had done so, walking naked and barefoot. Then the Lord said, "Just as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot for 3 years, as a sign and a portent against Egypt and Ethiopia, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptians as captives and the Ethiopians as exiles, both the young and old, naked and barefoot with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. And they shall be dismayed and confounded because of Ethiopia, their hope, and of Egypt, their boast. In that day, the inhabitants of this coastland will say, 'See, this is what has happened to those in whom we hoped, and to whom we fled for help and deliverance from the king of Assyria. And we, how shall we escape?'" My friends, this is the word of God. Let's just pray. Great God in heaven, we are deeply grateful that this book that comes to us is not simply a book of platitudes, lovely thoughts that come from somewhere else, but detached from the concrete and mortar of this world. But that rather this book that you've given us, this light for our lives, has come to us very much as part of the unfolding drama of history, the same history of which we are a part. And we pray that as we now undertake a study of the history of this world as it touches the history of your people, that you would open our eyes and give us those hearts disposed to recognize the truths that you've set before us for our own encouragement and faith. And we give you thanks for all of these things in the powerful name of Christ. Amen. Well, I don't want to labor this too long, but just spontaneously, as you read this text, you can just pipe up anybody, what questions come to mind? If you just read that, that's 6 verses long. If you were just reading this and thinking to yourself, whoa, what's going on here? What questions might pop to your mind? Anybody just want to shout something out? What question might occur to you reading this text? Go ahead.
Is it normal to walk around naked?
Well, yeah, that one does grab us right off the bat, doesn't it? I was thinking of illustrating the point this morning, but decided against it, And it does have dramatic flair to it, doesn't it? Let me say this about that. The sense of the Hebrew here is not naked as in the buff, which is really hard to imagine. Don't even try. But it means stripped to his tunic. It was sort of like being in your underwear a little bit. So it was, but it wasn't quite as forceful an image as may immediately come to mind. But no, it was not. It was not. But it was a common way to embarrass those who were the vanquished in conflict, to, in a sense, partially strip them and lead them away. So in that sense, it did happen for purposes of making a dramatic point, you might say. So, good question. Any other thoughts? What else just pops to mind as a question? Yeah. Okay, the city that they took, Ashdod. What does that have to do with anything? Where's Ashdod? Somehow Isaiah assumes we know, doesn't he? In the year that the commander took Ashdod. So there's a question. What else for questions?
Who is Sargon?
Who's Sargon? Last I knew, Sargon was the name of a chess game, Is this a real guy? Is this something like Uncle Remus or Brer Rabbit? I mean, who is this Sargon? Does he have any other... do we know anything about him aside from the fact that he makes a cameo appearance here in the Old Testament? Does he have an independent history that is accessible to us? What else?
What's going on with Ethiopia and Egypt?
Okay, what's this deal about Ethiopia and Egypt? These are real countries. We've heard of Ethiopia. We've heard of Egypt. We assume that they're probably roughly comparable in the ancient world to the nations that we think of today. But what's up with this, reference to them? I thought Isaiah was a prophet to the Jewish people. Why is he concerned about them? Good. Anything else come to mind?
Date and time in history.
Yeah, notice it starts right off. In the year that the commander-in-chief. Well, what year was that? And do you see, as we read it, the text is inviting us to ask some questions, and in a sense, assuming that if we can find answers to those questions, we might know a little bit more about what's going on in this very strange text. Well, I have to say that I, like you, for many years would read a text like that, puzzle for about 3 nanoseconds, and then just read on, hoping that maybe something somewhere along the line would start making a little more sense to me. And these kinds of texts, however, do leave us with these unanswered questions, little question marks hanging in our minds. And it's always a question, is there an easy way to figure out, what's behind the scenes? And probably one of the most common ways to do it is to grab a commentary. And you've probably taken a look at a commentary. They can be very good. And many times a commentary will give you some of that background, but the problem is, many times the commentaries themselves assume that you know quite a bit about ancient history, and so they kind of dive right into some details and don't really give you the lay of the land very well as well. In other words, it can be a bit of a challenge. My own view is that if we have some sense of the big scheme, that it does provide immense help for accessing a text like this and many, many others. And so my concern and my interest in teaching a class like this is, at least to in a preliminary way, help all of us to get some sense of the big picture. Therefore, let me just say to you up front, this is a class that will be dealing with history. I know some of you may be a little allergic to that term, as I once was. But get over it. The Bible comes to us as part of a historical narrative that's part of a great historical story of the human race. And so, insofar as we want to take the Bible seriously, we need to somehow or other come to terms with that historical aspect. It's not an end in itself. It's not that just being a historian or having some grasp of ancient history will fix all the problems in your life, make you successful in business or any such thing. But it does mean that as we begin to engage in the Scriptures, we may be able to do so more intelligently, and that in turn may lead us to hear its message more thoughtfully and correctly and apply it more properly in our own lives, rather than leaping to somewhat specious conclusions like, well, hey, if Isaiah walked around barefoot and naked, maybe I should walk around barefoot. We realize that we can get to some strange applications if we bypass what's called the historico-grammatical method, namely understand the text in its historical setting, asking what did the original author mean to communicate to the original audience. And to do that, we kind of got to get into their skin a little bit. So that's what this class is going to hopefully attempt to achieve. There's been a variety of views on this topic. How much, this is the question, how much is let's say, I'm going to use this term, a reasonably serious Christian, somebody that wants to go beyond just kind of a real superficial grasp of their faith. They want to be thoughtful in the way that they read the Scriptures. They want to have something more than just a cursory grasp of what's going on in the text and so on. There's always been a variety of opinions about how exactly Christians should relate to what's called external material. There's 2 extremes that you're at least casually familiar with, I'm sure. One would be what I'd call maybe something like biblical evidentialism. There are people running around who say we should be constantly out there looking at these external sources of information about the Bible because that proves the Bible is true. you know. And I've run into people like that, and so have you. And they get excited about every archaeological discovery, every, little artifact that comes up, anything like that. And the thought that this particular piece of data really proves the Bible. And that's been around for a long time. I think the first time we really see that sort of getting traction was way back in the Crusades. Urban II, the Pope at the time, authorized in 1095 the First Crusade. His stated purpose was to go and retake the Holy Land, But what may have been an unintended side effect of that was people went and found throughout the ancient Near East, that is the regions that had been the ancient Near East, all kinds of little artifacts, trinkets, which basically in that region were viewed as not much more than just trash. But when they brought them back to Europe, they found these things could be sold for a whole lot of money. And it opened up trade with the East. That's part of what drove the Renaissance, was the banking interest that flowed out of the products that were flowing back to Europe because of the Crusades, And this discovery that these things could be sold began to be attached to the idea that these proved the truth claims of the church and the truth claims of the Christian faith and the truth claims of the Bible and so on. And that's the first time we really hear that kind of argument being used. And it's continued really down through even to the present day. In the 19th century, the 1800s, there was a time of incredible, almost adventurism, in which people were running off to the regions of Mesopotamia and Arabia and so on, looking for sites, things, places, events, evidence thereof related to the Bible. This was really the heyday of the Indiana Jones type archaeological adventurer. There was a guy, a nobleman in England named Austin Henry Layard, Layard, who in about 1850 decided he was going to go find Nineveh. Nobody had ever found Nineveh. It shows up in the Bible. Jonah preached in Nineveh. It seems to be a pretty important city. Nobody had ever found it. Critical scholars at the time said, there's no such place. It's a myth. Austin Henry Layard said, I'm going to go find it. And off he goes. He had all the adventures of Indiana Jones on steroids. He was trapped by Bedouins. He had to escape in the night. All of it. It all happened with him, you see. And he searched around, rummaged around all of those arid places, and finally kind of triangulated where he thought it was after many, many misses, and he found it. Here was basically an untrained guy who went out there and found Nineveh. And one of the most important discoveries that was ever made was made. He found Ashurbanipal's library, which produced all kinds of writings and so on. Nobody could read it. It was in cuneiform. It took a while to figure it out. But nevertheless, he discovered this. And at the time, the headlines in the world trumpeted, "Archaeologist proves the Bible's true." Headlines in America and Europe and elsewhere, Well, is that true? I'd like to think it is, but I don't think so, I think what happens is that for those of us who are possessed of faith and possessed of confidence in the fundamental truth of the Christian message, we find these things to be heartily encouraging. We find that what we believe to be the biblical story is corroborated by these external discoveries. But if you're a confirmed skeptic, it'll never persuade you. It'll never turn you around. The skeptic just finds in it a way to resist the Christian message more intelligently by these discoveries. But that shouldn't surprise us, because Jesus himself made it clear that pure evidence, even miraculous evidence, will not convince a skeptic. Jesus most famously says, if they won't believe the Bible, they won't believe, period. Even if somebody returns from the dead, they won't believe. Because skepticism fundamentally is rooted in a moral disposition, not simply an intellectual doubt, you see. So let's not look for that. I mean, I certainly am happy to talk to a skeptic about these matters, and I think sometimes by God's grace that can be the wedge that begins to insinuate itself into their entrenched defenses. But in the final analysis, I don't think that's, apart from God's grace, going to be effective. But you have that, and we've had that all through history, kind of an interest in that external material for what I'd call evidential purposes, biblical evidentialism. On the other end, there are those who would be in a tradition really something like what I grew up in. I grew up in what I think, what many of you think of when you hear the term Christian fundamentalism would be pretty close to what I grew up in. Baptist, not all Baptists would be in this category, but the little group I was in, I think, fits that description. And the view that I had, really, and was inculcated into me by very sincere, wonderful, godly Sunday school teachers and others, was the Bible is sufficient. You don't need any of this other stuff. There was a positive skepticism towards scholarship, or creedal statements, or confessional statements, or other external material, historical or otherwise. There was this notion that if you just sit down and let the Spirit guide you, you will come to the truth of the Scripture because the Bible is sufficient. You don't need this other stuff. You know. And it took me a while to kind of get over that, to be honest. It certainly predisposed me against the kind of study that we're doing right here. I think it also set me up to appreciate it a lot more when I kind of tripped across it in later life and realized how enriching it could be. But you find that, I think you find it in more scholarly circles as well. I like Karl Barth. Karl Barth is, I think one of the great Christian theologians and thinkers and really heroes of the 20th century. Stood up against the Nazis in Germany in the 30s. Some of you know his story. But he's another one who really was very disparaging. He did not believe you should use archaeology in any sense to try to confirm the truth of the Scriptures. He believed that compromised the purity of your faith. And so you find it not only in kind of unsophisticated circles, but really much more thoughtful ones as well. Now, I'm overstating Barth's point there a little bit, but he did have a tendency to sort of minimize the importance of this. I'd like to walk a middle course. And so the philosophy of this class is going to be reflected in what I'm calling here redemptive history. This is not a term I invented. This has been around a long time. Many of you have heard that term, but I'd like to just unpackage it a little bit right now. The approach we're taking is to try to recognize that what we have in the Bible is redemptive history. The word redemptive is simply intended to say to us that the story of the Bible, and it is indeed a story, is a story of God's saving work. The Bible itself is a great story, isn't it? It begins with creation. You've got the flood. You've got the Tower of Babel. You certainly have, most importantly, Abraham, who's a particular guy. At least he's purported to be a particular guy. He's called from a place, Ur of the Chaldees. He's set apart. His family becomes a clan. His clan in Egypt becomes a nation. It's a story. That nation is liberated from Egypt under Moses, spends 40 years in a wilderness, goes to a promised land. It's a story. It's a story filled with drama. And the fundamental, if I can use this term, meta-narrative of that story, what's going on, is God is saving people. God is doing things in history to bring people to himself. We find that these people who settle in Canaan and become the nation of Israel sometimes are in good, condition and sometimes not so good. So we have prophets who come sometimes doing strange things like walking around in their underwear, bringing messages that were certainly intended to rattle the cage of the self-sufficiency of those who were feeling comfortable in their circumstances, to say to them that unless they got their hearts right with God, things were going to go sideways. And this warning message is part of the story. And all of this story, of course, is rolling down the track to a great consummate moment when God sends his only begotten Son as the culmination of this story and the great redemptive act. Well, that whole story is redemptive. It is intended to teach us that God is concerned about our welfare and is doing things in order to reach us. Now, there are those who would like to leave it at that the story is all that matters. We shouldn't be so concerned about whether there really was ever a guy named Abraham, or, an Exodus such as is purported to take place in the Bible, or Moses. There are people who would say you can be a good Christian and disbelieve all of this and sort of take it as if it were, in a sense, myth. And myth can be helpful, myth can be inspiring. We can be greatly helped by these wonderful stories, but let's not tax ourselves too hard to try to connect those stories to anything known about the actual history of the world, So the emphasis is on the word redemptive, but the word history is more or less negotiated off the chart here. Well, my approach is that it is redemptive history, but it's also redemptive history. That this story is part of a broader story. That God's work in history is part of a work in history, a history that is otherwise available to us, not simply from the Bible, but from other sources. And that we are well advised, helped, to try to not only see the biblical message from the perspective of the Bible, which is most important, but to see that same story from other perspectives. And that can actually give us a huge amount of help in appreciating what the Bible is saying, because it helps us understand what the Bible was saying to its original audience. Get ourselves into the world in which they were living, because when they heard about the commander-in-chief under a guy named Sargon going to Ashdod and taking that city, they were there. And they knew where that city was, and they knew why that was pertinent. We may not be quite so familiar with it. And it may leave us then somewhat more at loose ends. So it's redemptive history. And it seems to me that if we have that in balance, it's redemptive to be sure, but it's redemption in history, that we really give the Bible a new opportunity to speak in a meaningful way. So I have what I'd like to suggest are three great benefits. This is not an exhaustive list. It's not even a very bright list, but it's the best I could come up with, and you may want to add to it. But I've got three, what I'd like to suggest are benefits that will be ours by doing this investigation. The first is what I'd call the apologetic benefit. Now, this may surprise you because I was sort of dismissing this a little earlier, but I do think if you're a Christian person, you're possessed of genuine faith, you will find that as you examine the biblical narrative and find that the stories of the Bible are indeed confirmed, sometimes in their precise details, by sources outside the Bible, and in some cases sources that didn't care or even know about the Bible, that actually is somewhat confirming. To me, that's very encouraging, to know that we can go back to Assyrian annals and find accounts of events that are reported to us as well in the Bible, taking place in the same time frame and involving the same people. Isn't that kind of interesting? It seems to me that any thoughtful Christian would be pleased to know that there's actually some evidence that stands up to credible scholarship that says, yeah, this really did happen. Some years after the event that's mentioned here in Isaiah chapter 20, there was a king in Jerusalem named Hezekiah. Hezekiah, we learn in Isaiah chapter 36, 37, 38, and also in the latter parts of the book of 2 Kings in the Old Testament, was threatened by an Assyrian king named Sennacherib. Not Sargon, a different king. Sennacherib. You know the story. It's a famous kind of Sunday school story. Sennacherib shows up with a huge army. And he's doing all kinds of threatening, posturing, saber-rattling with respect to Hezekiah. And of course, Hezekiah and all the people of Israel are sort of holed up there in Jerusalem, withstanding this siege. And the guy that's called the Rabshakeh, which is the sort of spokesman for Sennacherib, is outside the walls, making all kinds of threatening statements. What makes you think that you people can withstand the splendor of the Assyrian king and his gods? What makes you think that you're any different from these other cities that have succumbed to our powerful, invasion and so on? What makes you think you're any different? This almost it is blasphemous, from a biblical point of view, challenge to the God of the Hebrews. And the people are in Jerusalem quaking in their boots. What are we going to do? He's got this vast army, and here we are. We don't have any way to meet with force. They're going to starve us out. It's over. And the biblical text tells us that when Hezekiah sent to Isaiah, the torn clothes, the dust and ashes on the head, that kind of Isaiah said, just don't worry, they'll never succeed. How can they not succeed? Have you looked out the window? Those guys. The biblical text tells us this, that God sent an angel that wiped out a huge chunk of that Assyrian army overnight. They woke up the next morning and there were a bunch of dead bodies. The Bible tells us that as a result of that, Sennacherib went home chagrined. Tail between his legs, back home. And that he was eventually assassinated by two of his sons. That's what the biblical text says, and that's where it leaves it. Now really, did anything like that actually happen? Well, one of the interesting discoveries that came out of Henry Austin Layard's uncovering of Ashurbanipal's library was a bunch of cuneiform texts giving annals of Assyrian military expeditions. You got to keep in mind there is spin in the ancient world just as there is spin in today's newspaper. In the ancient world there were spin doctors, and they did everything in their power to report what happened in the light most favorable to the nation doing the reporting. So you got to factor that in. But we have found this very battle reported in the Assyrian annals. What does it say? There's King Sennacherib. There's the Jewish king Hezekiah. They're both mentioned by name. Sennacherib went into the region of Syria, Canaan, Egypt, and that kind of area that separates those two, and it was there with a huge army. There's no mention of losing a bunch of soldiers overnight. That's not included. That doesn't fit the spin very well. What it actually says, for reasons that are not further explained, is that Sennacherib went home, leaving Hezekiah caged like a bird in Jerusalem. Now you kind of wonder, if he was caged as a bird in Jerusalem, why didn't he go ahead and take him? And of course, Hezekiah didn't remain caged as a bird. He walked outside the next morning, free as a bird. You see? The Assyrians don't mention that. They give us an accurate report, but they leave out all of the detail that doesn't sound very favorable. Then we hear 14 years later that Sennacherib was assassinated by his two sons for unrelated reasons, actually, in terms of history. And that brought the third son of Sennacherib to the throne, who's a guy named Esarhaddon, who's also mentioned in the Old Testament. My point in saying all of this is that when you actually compare the hard data, you find out that there's just a striking correlation, but the perspective is very different depending on who's reporting it. Then we have the same story told again about 1,000 years later. Well, no, I'm sorry, not that. This took place about 700, let's say 300 years later, by the Greek historian Herodotus. He tells us the very same story. He's more detached. He's 300 years removed. He knows there was this very strange reversal of fortunes the Assyrians had. He asked some people in Egypt, what's up with this? And they said, oh, there was a plague of rats that invaded the Assyrian army that night, and that was the reason all these guys died. Well, there's nothing in the Bible about rats. I don't know if there were rats there or not, but do you see how that happens? You have this these interesting kind of parallel coincidences. And what does it mean for us? It just gives us, first of all, some degree of confidence that this is not just fairy tale, that these events actually happened. And at least from a biblical point of view and a Christian point of view, we place our greatest confidence in the biblical record as probably giving us the most accurate rehearsal of it. So I think the apologetic benefit is worth noting. The educational benefit. It helps to know history. By the way, somebody help me here. When is this class over? Is it 11? Okay. Okay. And the second service begins at 11:15. Is that right? Okay. Okay, good. All right. See, new schedule. All right. So the educational bit. You've all heard the expression, those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it. And there's some truth to it. I was saying earlier that my own experience in interest in history is I'm always surprised to hear myself say that I love history because it was not always that way. I went to a little school in a rural community in Washington State where in high school I was taught history by the football coach. That in itself was a message to me, you know. And of course the football coach was very interested in football. I was very aware of that. I didn't play football, but I liked the game, and he would spend most of the history class drawing X's and O's on the blackboard and talking about his latest scheme for a, game-winning play for this weekend. I remember this distinctly. And of course, the message I drew, the interpretation I drew from this experience is history must not matter very much, because obviously this guy doesn't care much about it. It must just be irrelevant. Probably some bureaucrat somewhere is required that we teach history for reasons that I can't fathom, a kind of exercise in futility or rite of passage or something, but it really doesn't matter much. And that was the impression I had when I graduated from high school and went to my beloved alma mater, Whitworth College, where I avoided history with every ounce of my energy. Whitworth at the time, and still does, had a wonderful gold mine history department. If I'd had an ounce of sense about me, I would have been a history major just like that. But I avoided history because I knew it was irrelevant, had no bearing on my life, and I shouldn't waste my time. And so I took the one history course I was required to take at Whitworth. It was called Western Civ. It was taught by a guy who was fresh back from the mission fields, a wonderful man, Presbyterian missionary. He couldn't teach history worth beans. He was fired the next semester. So my only experience in college of history simply confirmed everything I knew. And then when I graduated from Whitworth, I bluffed my way into a teaching job in a little Bible school, and one of my responsibilities was to teach church history, which I couldn't understand. Why is this in the curriculum? Even in my wonderful Baptist tradition, again, this is not true of all Baptists. I'm not painting with a very broad brush, but at least in my narrow tradition, church history was utterly ignored. And the impression I had was that there were some Christians back in the first century, and then everything went dark. And for about 2,000 years, nothing. And then Baptists popped up in the 20th century, and here we are. That was kind of the way that I sort of viewed it. And so teaching church history, I couldn't, but I wanted the job, so I agreed to do it. And that, my friends, was when I fell in love with history. That's what turned me into a Presbyterian, was teaching church history. I fell in love with the Reformation, with that whole grand sweep of how God has been at work. And that, of course, got me thinking more about history otherwise. And my only point in saying all of this little personal anecdotal stuff, is to simply say, as a matter of personal testimony, this has been just one of the most wonderfully enriching areas to become familiar with. I think it helps us understand so much of the world in which we live, which has been shaped not only by modern history, but by ancient history. We still live in a great story that's unfolding that began thousands of years ago, and it's helpful to understand something of that. The third benefit that I think flows from all of this is what I'm calling the interpretive benefit. It helps us understand the Scripture. During the Reformation, the method of understanding the Bible that came to be current was called the historico-grammatical method. The word grammar meant understanding the language the historical part of that meant understanding the way in which the historical setting affected the message. And that became a very important part of the Reformed tradition, which of course we represent here. And it helps us understand the Bible. I'd like to come back in the last couple of minutes to this text. We'll deal with this again in a few months, so I just want to give a kind of a quick sketch of what was going on here, just so we understand something of the benefit that you gain from knowing something of the historical setting. What was going on? The king of Egypt at the time was an Ethiopian. His name was Shabaka. Sounds like a guy from Star Wars, I know, but he wasn't. He was a very awesome warrior, and the Ethiopians dominated Egyptian life at that time. He was angry with the Assyrians. Now, if you know your geography, you know that you got Egypt down here, you've got Assyria up here, you got Israel, sandwiched in the middle. So here's Assyria, here's Egypt and Ethiopia, and here's Israel in a squeeze play. The Egyptian-Ethiopian ruler Shabaka wanted to inspire a revolt against the Assyrians because it had affected their finances, their economic, their trade life had been negatively affected. And so he sent out in about the year 714 BC emissaries all around the ancient, that region, Israel, Phoenicia, Syria, so on, various major city-states, trying to get them to join him in a coalition that would rebel against the Assyrians, you see. In fact, if you flip back just one page in your Bible to chapter 18, you have this very interesting statement. Listen to this. Ah, land of whirring wings beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, sending ambassadors by the Nile in vessels of papyrus on the waters. Go, you swift messengers, to a people tall and smooth, those are Ethiopians, to a people feared near and far, a nation mighty and conquering, whose land the rivers divide. This is Isaiah's assessment of these ambassadors from Ethiopia who are coming, trying to entice Hezekiah to join in this revolt. And Isaiah says, nothing doing. This thing's going to come to a bad end, and you don't want to be a part of it. It made zero political sense for Hezekiah to trust Isaiah's counsel, because everybody else was doing this, and it looked like a united front would be sufficient to throw off that Assyrian domination. But Isaiah said, don't do it. Everybody else joined in. And that was the reason why in chapter 20, this commander came to Ashdod, because Ashdod was sort of the centerpiece of the coalition against the Assyrians. He took it. And now the question was, would everybody else who was in that coalition run to the rescue of the king of Ashdod, you see? And the question was, would Hezekiah change his mind and join in? There was immense political pressure on Hezekiah not to hold out. You know that feeling of being very lonely. Everybody else is doing it. What's up with you, Hezekiah? And to drive home the point, Isaiah stripped off his clothes and said, here's what's going to happen to the people who try to join in this rebellion. God can take care of you, Hezekiah. But if you want to wind up looking sort of the way I do right now, then join in. Otherwise, don't, We have Assyrian annals that indicate to us that about 2 years later, that entire rebellion was crushed, and Ethiopian soldiers who were so powerful, so impressive, these courageous types were hauled off with chains around their necks and sometimes hooks through their lips, stripped in a long kind of chain gang going back to Assyria, you see. And Isaiah had driven the point home. Well, all of that happened, and we have that from external sources, and that all of a sudden makes this chapter kind of make sense, doesn't it? See, we find out, whoa. And what's the lesson we learn? We learn that we should trust God. I mean, that's a simple lesson. We probably could have figured that out anyway. But to see something of the drama out of which that particular text flowed gives it much more potency. And so, as we're about the business of deciding whether we should trust, the counsel of the world or trust God's word. We hopefully are helped by a text like this to know that God knows better, and that is where our confidence should lie. Next week, we are going to we're going to start in Mesopotamia. If you do have the book and you want to kind of, follow along, then maybe the first 20 or so pages, not chapters, pages would be of help. But otherwise, we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 1. That's our first biblical text. And we're going to be comparing it to a Mesopotamian creation myth called Enuma Elish. And we're going to note not only how it is similar, which may surprise some of you, but also how it differs. But we're going to notice how God was speaking to the mindset of ancient people, saying things to them that made sense to them in their view of the universe. And that's why some of what's in Genesis chapter 1 strikes us as odd, because of course it's intended for ancient hearers using a cosmology that they assumed. And I think it helps for us to appreciate. So that's what we're doing next week. And I hope you'll be able to find your way back at that time. Then I will start.